Chapter 5. A Daring Rescue. After the first moment of panic, Joseph sat down and tried to think. He can't have gone far, Zachary said. Maybe he went to your carriage for something to eat. Hannah Douglas, the girl who carried Wash back and forth for her mother, was standing by herself, watching the games. Are you looking for your little brother? She asked. Joseph nodded. I saw him walking back toward the barns, she said. Suddenly, Joseph knew where his brother had gone. The bull. You told him it was gentle, he said accusingly. Zachary looked stricken. I was joking. The boys set off at a dead run. They passed the vendors still singing their chants. People stared as they pushed through the crowds. At last, the pen was in sight. Joseph stopped, sighing with relief. No small boy clung to the fence. He turned to go when Zachary suddenly grabbed his arm. He's inside the pen, he gasped. Joseph moaned. He could see Jared now. He had crawled through the fence and was walking toward the bull. The bull pawed the ground nervously, his horns lowered. No one else seemed to notice what was happening. Joseph started toward the fence, but Zachary grabbed his arm. Let me circle around and get his attention. Then you grab Jared. Joseph nodded. Zachary raced in a wide circle around the pen. The bull snorted loudly, and for the first time, Jared looked nervous. He looked back at the fence and spotted Joseph. I don't think he likes me, Jared said. Step backward, very slowly, Joseph said. He kept his gaze riveted on the bull, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Zachary was climbing the fence behind the animal. Jared took one slow step backward, and Joseph squeezed under the lowest rail. He inched his way over to Jared, keeping his eyes on the bull. The bull twitched with annoyance as a big fly landed on his back. He pawed the dust with one hoof and watched the boys. Careful not to make any sudden movements, Joseph reached for Jared. He nodded to Zachary, signaling that he was in position. Immediately, Zachary took off his hat and waved it. Hey, bull! He screamed. Over here! For one brief moment, the bull was distracted. He turned toward the new irritation, snorting with anger. Joseph's fingers tightened around his brother's arm. There's a child in the bull's pen, a lady screamed. The bull seemed to rear up in the air as he wheeled back toward the boys. Run! Shouted Zachary. Joseph did not need to be told. Gripping his brother's arm, he yanked Jared off his feet and in one motion threw him under the fence. He dived after him, rolling free just as the bull hit the fence with a loud thump that seemed as though it would break the rails. The fence held, however, and Joseph stood up, still shaking. He helped his brother to his feet. Are you all right? He asked. Jared nodded, but his face was white under his freckles. Joseph saw that Hannah had followed them. She smiled shyly. That was the bravest thing I'd ever saw, she said. Embarrassed, Joseph shrugged. Not really. I was scared to death. Zachary ran around the fence and patted his back. That was one bad-tempered bull, he exclaimed. Joseph's knees were weak at the thought of what could have happened. A small crowd was gathering. Suddenly worried that his parents would hear the commotion, Joseph grabbed Jared and slipped away from the well-wishers. They lost themselves among the food vendors' wagons. Don't tell Mama I went in the bull's pen, Jared pleaded. I won't, Joseph promised. Don't you tell that I lost you. I'm sorry I didn't wait like you told me, Jared said seriously. I was just going to pet the bull and come right back. Well, here's a good rule to remember, Zachary said. Never pet anything with 3-foot horns. They walked to the picnic grounds. Joseph saw with relief that his mother was busily laying out the dinner on a blanket. She was humming to herself as she worked. Obviously, she had not heard about Jared's narrow escape. Mr. Byers was nearby tending the horses. There you are, she said. I was beginning to think we would have to eat up all this food ourselves. This is my friend Zachary, Joseph said. He's the one who saved me the other night. Mrs. Byers wrapped her arms around Zachary and hugged him so long he squirmed with embarrassment. Thank you for saving my son, she said simply. Zachary's face flamed bright red. Oh, it wasn't much, he said. He ducked his head and drew a circle in the dirt with his toe. Would you like to eat with us? Mrs. Byers asked. Zachary hesitated. It looks mighty good. Then it's settled, Mrs. Byers said. She handed him a plate filled with fried chicken, cornbread, and baked beans. For dessert, there was cherry pie. Clay came jogging up to the carriage, looking with hunger at all the food. I just have a few minutes before I get back to work. Did you see all that excitement? He asked around Bites. Somebody told me that a little boy was attacked by a bull. Oh dear, Mrs. Byers said. Is he all right? Clay gave Joseph and Zachary a suspicious look. It seems that 2 other boys saved him. I wish we could have seen that, Joseph said, trying to sound innocent. It must have been exciting. The picnic grounds were getting crowded as more and more families came to eat. Mr. Byers finished graining the horses and joined them for the meal. He looked surprised to see Zachary, but when Mrs. Byers explained, he shook Zachary's hand. That was a fine rescue. Joseph told us all about it, he said warmly. Jared finished his meal and leaned up against his mother. I'm tired, he said sleepily. Why don't you take a little nap before we go back? Said Mrs. Byers. She fetched an old blanket from the carriage and wrapped it around him. I didn't like that bad bull, Jared murmured as he drifted off to sleep. Mr. Byers gave Joseph a hard look. What bull is he talking about? Clay stared at Joseph. It was you! Mrs. Byers' hands flew to her face. Jared was the boy in the bull's pen? She gasped. It was my fault, Zachary said. I told him the bull was gentle. Mr. Byers frowned at Joseph. I am proud of you for saving your brother, yet I wonder how it happened in the first place if you had been taking care of him like you were told. Joseph hung his head. I didn't. I was trying to catch the greased pig. And you were deceitful about it, scolded Joseph's mother. Clay gave Joseph a sympathetic look. I have to get back to work, he said, handing his mother the empty plate. Mrs. Byers placed the dishes and remaining food back in the basket. Her husband picked up Jared and tucked him into the carriage with the blanket. The races will be starting soon, but Jared is tired, he said. Since you didn't tend to your brother earlier, you can do it now. Joseph bit his lip in disappointment as his mother and Mr. Byers strolled back to the fairgrounds. Joseph sat down on the ground and leaned his back against one of the carriage wheels. He looked at Zachary. You better hurry or you'll miss the start of the races. Zachary sat down beside him and shrugged. I'll stay with you. Zachary was a true friend, Joseph thought. He looked out over the picnic grounds. They were nearly empty now as families headed toward the racetrack. Two Quaker families, the men in their broad brimmed hats, the women in their dark clothes, lingered together some distance away. Joseph recognized Mr. Baker, who owned a small furniture store in town. He had a strange manner of speaking. He used words like thee and thou. His son David was in Joseph's room at school, but Joseph didn't know him very well. Suddenly, two rough looking men on horseback rode into the picnic clearing. They galloped over to Joseph and Zachary. "We're looking for an escaped slave," one of them said. "You seen any black folk around here you don't know?" It was the two men he'd seen earlier in the day talking to his stepfather. Joseph shook his head. "No, sir," he said politely. The man stared at Zachary. "How about you?" "Nope," Zachary said shortly. The men wheeled their horses and rode over toward the Quaker families. "Maybe we ought to go look for the slave. Might be some reward money," Zachary said. Joseph shrugged. "How would we catch him even if we did find him?" he asked. "Anyway, he's probably halfway to the Ohio River by now. And I have to stay here with Jared, remember?" Zachary nodded and spit on the ground. "A lot of Yankees helped them escape. They don't even care that their owners probably paid a lot of money for them." Joseph did not reply. He was watching the slave catchers. Mr. Baker was standing up facing the two horsemen. Then the two men circled him. They were shouting, but Joseph was too far away to hear what. Mr. Baker was shaking his head. Then one of the men took something off the saddle of his horse. It was a long black whip. The man let it drag along the ground, a silent threat as he talked. Again, Mr. Baker shook his head. The man with the whip made a quick motion with his wrist, and the whip cracked in a threatening manner. "Why are they being so rough with Mr. Baker?" Joseph asked. "Sometimes Quakers help the slaves escape," Zachary said quietly. "My pa claims almost all of them are abolitionists." Watching the two men bully the Quaker made Joseph feel uncomfortable. He looked at the fairground, hoping someone would come along, but the two men seemed tired of their cruel game, or perhaps they finally believed Mr. Baker. The man with the whip snapped it in the air again with a loud crack. Then they galloped away. As soon as they were gone, the Quakers quickly gathered their belongings and hurried away. Joseph walked over to the carriage and peeked at Jared, still sleeping soundly. "Hey, Mud Boy," Zachary said in a teasing voice. "It's getting late, and Pa will be mad if I don't get my chores done. I'd better get home. I had a good time today." With a friendly wave, he was off. Joseph sat down on a nearby boulder. The picnic grounds were completely empty now except for Jared and him. The races had started. Joseph could hear the crowd cheering. The afternoon dragged slowly on, and still Jared slept. It was not until the races were over and the sun was low in the sky that he finally awoke and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Then he climbed out of the carriage, still looking tired in spite of his nap. Joseph saw the rest of his family heading back. Clay was holding the box of Joseph's carvings. "Your eagle won a blue ribbon," Clay announced. Mr. Byers handed him a ribbon and coins. "There was a prize of $3. I'm sorry that your punishment kept you from being there to receive it," he said as the family climbed in for the trip back to the livery stable. Joseph sat down glumly and did not speak. His mother gave him a sympathetic look. Everyone was amazed at how nice they were. "You have more money than I do, and I worked all day," Clay said, obviously trying to make him feel better. Joseph was so unhappy that he forgot to tell his family about the two strangers and their hunt until they had turned in the carriage and were walking home, Jared safely perched on his stepfather's back. Since Congress passed the fugitive slave law, bounty hunters can go to any state, slave or free, to bring them back, Mr. Byers said grimly. I even saw a poster warning free black people to be careful because there have been cases where the bounty hunters have kidnapped them to sell them in the deep south. Of course, no one believes them when they say they are free. Joseph was only half listening to his stepfather. He was tired of thinking about slavery and war. Let the grown ups concern themselves with things like that. For himself, he had enough things to worry about. There was a new home, a new school, a stepfather he didn't like, and a father's face that was fading away when he closed his eyes and tried to remember it at night.